Chapter 281. Oops. Three skeletons and Jay brought their swords down, foolishly so, onto high-pressure roots. A minor cut was all it took to release a dangerous jet of high-speed fluid. The jets damaged each of their swords and flung their arms back. Lamp fell off the bundle of roots, almost shattering the glowing jar mounted in a shepherd's crook. The cracks in the roots split wider, and shot against other roots, also cutting them open with ease. Oh shit! Jay ran towards the door, hiding on the other side and expecting its opening. The skeletons followed Jay along, seeing how the situation changed. The fluid gushed out with tremendous force, forming a larger and larger fountain, and ripping apart the remaining roots as if they were paper. Finally, a deep hurling sound came from Jay's side. The door was cracking open, and light gleamed out. As soon as it opened enough to fit someone through, three knights sprinted outwards the bursting roots. They knew it was bad, but didn't know it would be this bad. Each of them stood at the side, lowering their swords as they watched the chaotic fountain. Suddenly, a jet of green fluid shot towards one knight. The knight paused, dropped its sword, and then shuddered. The jet pierced its armor and instantly filled its insides as if it were a balloon. It had no time to react. Shring. The other two knights dropped to their knees. The skeletons decisively slayed them, taking advantage of their turned backs. 115, exp 115 exp. All three knights died, but the door remained open. Jay focused on his goal, and was peeking through the door. The odd lights inside drew his attention first. Luminous sticks, Jay thought, seeing the bright lights through the giant stone doors. A pure white light came from long glowing rods in the ceiling, dispersing all the darkness. Just beyond the door was a steel balcony overlooking the doorway. In the middle was something like a podium. No eyes were on Jay as he peeked through, though Jay saw a knight running from the podium on the balcony. I bet they control the gate up there. Good thing it didn't see me. Boys, quick, we're going in. The skeletons rushed back to their master after the fresh kills, while Red had already slipped between the giant doors and entered the room, with Jay following. Inside the room entrance was a small moat with a metal bridge going over the top. They did not fill the moat with water or anything, and it was as deep as Jay was tall. It was simply there to slow down enemies. Jay could easily climb out if he fell in, and it would only be a problem if there were enemies around, harassing him from the other side. The bridge itself impressed Jay as they formed it from one complete piece of metal, and had a pattern of small thumb-sized holes across in it. However, there was no time for analysis. Across the bridge and below the balcony, a hallway stretched to the underground compound, turning left and right at the end. Speeding over the bridge, Jay soon heard sounds of rustling armor. Any 00V Euros LS set 1N hosted the premiere release of this chapter. It wasn't the usual ordered, rhythmic sounds of marching, but a chaotic mess of frantic clunking which was getting noisier. Clearly, the knights were distressed and now disordered. To Jay, it sounded more like a rock slide or heavy rain. He couldn't even see them yet, but in a matter of moments the sound was becoming almost deafening. Damn it. Too many, too fucking many, he thought, shaking his head with a smile of disbelief. Jay stopped his dash down the hallway. Gazing back at the door, he thought about rushing out, but knew it wasn't an option. That room will be the first place they search, and I'm already locked in the castle. There's no going back now. Looking back at the hallway, he saw the first shadow of the knights coming. Jay looked down at the moat below. It was his only option. Move. He immediately jumped into the moat. The skeletons followed along, and together they huddled under the metal bridge. Jay put his disgust at touching the skeletons aside and huddled with them. He quickly grabbed the end of Lamp's shepherd's crook and stuffed it into his bag, stopping any light from escaping, and in moments, the first enemy ran over the bridge. Clong clong cling. The metal boots of knights began stomping above their heads. Jay placed his hand over his mouth. He looked up cautiously, peering through the thumb-sized holes at the passing knights. For once, he was glad their armor was so concealing. It blocked some of their sight, stopping them from looking below their feet, and finding the four infiltrators hiding in the shadows of the bridge. Jay steadied his breathing and tried to calm himself, but also came up with some worst-case scenarios, and thought about how he would get out of them. Many of the solutions involved flooding the room with bones. Your skeleton is no more. Ah. So they can unsummon themselves. Jay thought, but they'll have to wait before I can bring them back. Tens of nights passed, and soon over 100, yet the sounds of them somehow became louder. Jay just made himself still, focusing on being quiet and calm despite the stressful, life-threatening situation. It would have caused many others in his situation to panic, but Jay knew there was nothing gained from doing so. After a while, he received another notification, and his mood quickly improved. Ability acquired. Stealth level 1. Oh. He raised a brow. Well, I guess it makes sense. I have concealed my presence while all these nights have passed, he thought. With nothing else to do, he checked the new skill. Stealth level 1, passive. Level 1, the shadows ever so slightly bend towards you, protecting you as one of their own. Less chance of being detected. Greater chance of noticing other stealthy beings. Awesome. All I have to do is sit still and I get better, he thought with a sly smile, knowing the same was true for his skeletons. Jay relaxed under the bridge, yet even now there were knights stomping across it. Many had left, exiting out the giant stone doors. It was more than enough to deal with the burst roots, and he guessed they were rushing up the numerous staircases, searching for whoever did this. Some time later, after what seemed like hundreds of knights had passed over, the amount now running across the bridge slowed down a great deal, from a river to a trickle. The stragglers were making their way out. Seems like there's some in every group, Jay thought. Clunk clang clang ring. Suddenly, a rusted metal sword fell, dropped by a clumsy charging knight. It rang as it skittered across the stone floor. The sword caught Jay's eye as it landed just on the edge of the moat, the blade hanging over the edge. Meanwhile, its owner was halfway over the bridge, having too much momentum to slow down. Fuck. Jay immediately clenched his jaw as his eyes widened. Looking up through the thumb-sized holes, Jay saw the knight slow down on the bridge, and turned to walk back, fetching its sword. Jay watched on in horror as his mind raced. All the calmness he had cultivated disappeared in mere seconds. It might see us when it bends down. What do I do? What can we do? Chapter 282 Paths. Jay and 3 skeletons, Red, Lamp and Sweeper, had remained undetected as they huddled under the metal bridge. Numerous knights had marched over, and Jay had lost count at some point. He guessed there were hundreds. His plan was to wait here until all the knights left, and now there were some stragglers slowly filtering out of the complex. Over time, he had calmed himself and became used to the stress of hiding under the enemy's nose. However, a clumsy straggler had dropped his sword, which was now teetering on the edge of the bridge. Its rusted blade gleamed in the lights above. It was like a searchlight spotting them out. The clumsy knight walked back across the bridge. Sweeper, you're the closest. If it looks at as, grab it. Sweeper glowed its eyes at Jay and assumed a crouching position, while Jay and the other skeletons readied their swords. The knight marched over and leaned down to grab its sword. Its visor revealed the moat well forwards, and something caught its eyes. An odd shadow, perhaps. Its rusted helmet slowly ground to the side. Jay responded before it could. Now. A skeleton pounced from the shadows, its bone claws outstretched. 3 other beings were behind it with swords pointed at it, staring with vicious hunger, looking like they wanted to consume it. Raising its gauntlet, it blocked the pouncing skeleton. Its claws scraped off a dust of red but couldn't find a grip. The parasite saw enemies and, being alone, it only had one motive. Warn the brothers. It left its sword, standing back up straight again. Lamp, do it. Suddenly, a green flash appeared. Blow pod. The parasite thought. Yet something suddenly pulled his neck back. Lamp had wrapped a shepherd's crook around the neck of the knight. Jay, Red and Lamp all pulled, causing the knight to stumble back and fall. Without hesitation, they dragged it into the moat. The defenseless knight died without a fight as the skeletons held it down and plunged their swords through the gaps in its armor. Drag its body under the bridge, Jay commanded. Checking there were no parasites on him, he grabbed the knight's sword, which was still sitting on the edge of the moat. 115 exp. Problem averted, he thought. Any 00V Euros LS set 1N hosted the premiere release of this chapter. Jay went to move under the bridge, but paused. The knight's green blood was squirming with smaller parasites. Some were as small as a fingernail, while others were as long as a dagger. Just one of those would end me, Jay thought. He didn't think they could leave the dungeon, but if one burrowed into his skin and slowly ate through his spine, then the chances of leaving the dungeon at all would plummet. The 3 skeletons huddled under the bridge with the knight, and there was no room left for Jay either, at least, not enough room to be clear of the parasite-infested blood. Another knight would come soon, so Jay waited at the back of the gate room in the corner. Because of the army of knights moving out, it had been ear-piercingly loud, as they had tossed Jay into a violent storm, but now much of the marching had grown quieter. Jay could hear a knight coming down the hallway and stood back against the wall. He could only hope it didn't turn its head. However, the knight slowed down, even before it came into the gate room. Huh? Jay turned his head. Shit. Lamp's shepherd's crook had left Jay's bag to grab the clumsy knight, along with the luminous jar still attached. It glowed brightly under the bridge. Lamp, hide the damn light. Jay's eyes bulged as he stared at the skeleton with anger. Jay had his bag with him. Lamp looked around awkwardly for a moment, and then stuffed it into the only place it could think of. Under its human skin. The jar glowed under its ribs, and a soft glow came from Lamp's eyes, though it wasn't enough to be noticeable, not with the pure white lights in the room. Yet, the approaching knight had already seen. Get ready. The knight moved into the room, not noticing Jay in the corner as it fixated its focus on the bridge. It wasn't cautious, but curious, its sword lowered as it approached. It probably thought another knight had foolishly placed a glow pod, luminous jar, down there. Lamp awkwardly held the jar under his flesh, while the other skeletons readied themselves. Hopefully Sweeper would grab the enemy this time, and wouldn't be forced to reveal the light-bearing shepherd's crook. The knight made it to the side of the moat. Immediately, it saw its fallen comrade surrounded by skeletons. A skeleton pounced as it readied its sword. The skeleton grabbed its gauntlet, but the knight braced itself. It brought the sword down and was about to free its arm. Thud. A blow to its back sent it toppling into the moat. Piercing swords slid through its armor, yet it only had one last thought. Who hit me? 115 exp. Jay's Spartan kick was a resounding success. The skeletons dragged another body under the bridge, stacking it onto the other knight's corpse. It was getting cramped, but the skeletons could still mostly hide their presence. Jay returned to the corner of the room, pressing his body as close to the wall as he could. A few minutes passed, and another knight ran across the bridge, this time not noticing anything. Jay sighed in relief, though he still felt tense. An army was just outside the doors, while he was at a dead end. Trapped with only one way in and out. This is so fucked up. He thought, but I planned for this. Just calm down and think logically. He nodded. I'll need to reveal my presence again to push deeper. If we block the knights from getting out, the army won't be warned, either. Loose bones are up there somewhere, hidden. Handy is still running around. Once they discover their corpses, they'll realize I'm down here, or at least that there are more enemies than what they realized. They will probably do a thorough search, so I just need to act before then. He nodded as another knight ran over the bridge. Jay moved from his position and quickly glanced down the hallway, then looked up to the balcony with the podium. If we can get to the gate controls, we'll be fine, or we can rush into the compound and try to slay the plant. Hopefully, it will be over after that. Jay glanced up at the metal balcony above. They built it into the wall so there were no supporting structures to climb up, a good tactical decision, while the walls were as smooth as polished leather. The balcony was a little over 2 stories high. It would meet the floor of a 3rd story if compared. It could safely look down on the 3-story tall stone gates and see into the moat below. Despite how high up it was, Jay smiled slyly as he sensed an opportunity. I guess they didn't design this with the undead in mind. Before making another move, Jay returned to the corner and waited for the next knight to pass. Chapter 283 Split. Another knight charged across the bridge, this time not noticing Jay in the corner or its dead comrades below its feet. They use smells to get around and communicate. I'm surprised they don't release a smell after death. A death scent, Jay thought. I bet they don't like windy days, although in the Crucible there's probably not much wind, anyway. As the knight left through the giant stone doors, Jay only called up one skeleton from under the bridge. Sweeper. Remove your armor and get up here. Quick. Sweeper stripped off its rusted armor and jumped out of the trench as Jay pointed upward to the balcony. Jump up there. Jay commanded. Jay picked Sweeper over the other two, as it had no real armor or stolen skin, weighing it down, real armor being that which is looted, rather than physically removed from enemies, and can leave the dungeon. With its weapon in hand, Sweeper jumped over 1 story high, which was impressive, but it only made it halfway to the platform. Without its weapon, it gained more height, but it simply wasn't enough. On the 3rd attempt, Jay helped it by giving it a push upwards too, but it made the skeleton spin and land on its head, while still not getting close enough to even touch the platform above, much less find a handhold. Damn, Jay thought, making a mental note to make himself a simple bone ladder. Sometimes the simplest tools are the most useful. He nodded, pursing his lips. Jay sent Sweeper back to hide under the bridge and equip his stolen armor, before another knight came charging through the room. They will have found the body we stole that armor from by now, and they don't even know we're in here, which is the best part. In the meantime, we'll just have to go deeper. As the knight left through the doors, the skeletons emerged from the bridge, and Jay quickly resummoned Blue. Again, Jay was a little disappointed seeing that it had lost the squire armor upon death, but at the very least, it kept its spectral bone armor. Jay sent the skeletons forwards through the hallway to stand just before the T intersection, while Blue reformed. This way, a knight would blindly charge around the corner into the skeletal arms of death. Blue was nearly ready as the skeletons were in place, but making the most of his time, Jay made Blue wield one of the knight's rusted swords. It wasn't the best, but it would be enough to get between the enemy armor and sever the spinal parasite. The knights themselves had health they could whittle down with standard attacks, but the parasites made it pointless to even bother with it. I'm glad I autopsied the corpse of the first knights we fought, discovering the weak spot, otherwise this low-level dungeon would have been a nightmare. He smiled to himself, really wanting to have said it out loud and fill the dungeon with echoes of his own laughter. Jay told Blue his joke and was repaid with an empty stare. Jay had never seen a skeleton be so emotionless and undead. With Blue ready, they both dashed down the hallway towards the other three skeletons. The hallway itself was about as wide as two knights, but only one knight could fight properly in it. As Jay came closer to his skeletons, he didn't give Blue command over them just yet, as he had his own plans. Clang. The knight suddenly dashed around the corner. It met the skeletons with its chest plate and helmet, smashing into the wall of bones. It couldn't even raise its sword. The knight lost a step, grazed against the wall, and fell on top of Lamp. Instead of pushing it off, Lamp held onto it, embracing it on the ground as it struggled. Of course, it wasn't an act of passion as its claws plunged through the knight's neck, green blood squirting everywhere. The knight pushed against the ground but couldn't even move. Two skeletal feet were pressing on its back, one from each skeleton. Two clean thrusts, and the other two skeletons instantly executed it. Sweeper and Red helped Lamp up. 115 X. Jay, however, looked back down the hallway he had just ran through. The darkness through the doors gave him a tense feeling. The doors will remain open for now. I can't let any more knights leave, as they may alert the army outside. NEO v Euros Rapture marked the initial hosting of this chapter on NEO Circumflex v Euros LSZN. I'm just counting on none of them coming back through these doors, he thought, and turned back to looking at the T intersection. Looking T intersection, he spotted two signs on the wall. Painted onto the wall was a large yellow letter R with an arrow to the right, and a large letter C with an arrow to the left. RC. Jay thought for a moment as he approached. For a moment he wondered what they could mean, but Blue caught up, and he didn't want to waste any more time. Jay turned around, and a wave of bones flew from his gauntlet once more, blocking off the hallway they just ran down. This bone barrier didn't reach the ceiling, but was taller than Jay. Blue, hold this area and don't let a single enemy pass. Take Lamp and Sweeper for help. Blue nodded, and Sweeper moved into a fighting stance at its side. Now RC. Jay turned back to the intersection. C. Jay impulsively decided and sent Red left before falling closely behind. The letters meant nothing to him, but he remembered one key detail. The plant had entered on the left side of the grand stone gate. Another thing made Jay wonder, though, which was why the knights came from the right, but the plant, presumably, lived on the left. As he ran left, he noticed Lamp was following him. You can take Lamp too, Blue. Jay added, but Lamp simply kept following. I guess Blue doesn't need Lamp. It's quite confident now or far too cocky. The left passage went straight, then turned right for a while before opening into a larger hall. The floor was a smooth polished stone, but most of the walls seemed to be covered with metal sheets and pipes. Various doors led to different rooms, while a staircase on the left side of the room led deeper. No staircases going upwards. Damn. Maybe the gate controls were through the right passage. There were no glass jars filled with luminous fluid here, as there were still the pure white glowing rods in the ceiling, chasing away every shadow. I wonder what kind of magic that is. Jay wondered. Red stayed at Jay's side, while Lamp crept into the hall and peered through a doorway on the right side. Look for any signs of the plant, Jay added, making sure Lamp was not just searching for more skin. Jay followed along cautiously and began to scan the rooms. The first room had many shining, silvery cabinets in rows, along with racks mounted to the ceiling with hanging pots, pans, and other cooking implements Jay had never seen. A kitchen. He raised a brow, though to Jay it looked nothing like one. Luxurious and advanced, he wondered who could afford such food from this giant, metal-filled kitchen. He did a quick loot, but nothing came of it. Alright, well, not every room's gonna be filled with weapons and treasure. He shrugged, leaving the room. As Jay walked back into the hallway, a noise sounded from behind. VRR click. Jay jumped back with his sword ready. Red was at his side and ready to strike at the assailant. Yet there was no enemy. There were originally no doors, but now, in the doorway, two metal panels had appeared with a seam in the middle, forming a door that seemed to come out of the walls. Jay curiously lowered his sword. The doors closed themselves. Chapter 284 Keys. Jay stepped closer to the door, looking for buttons or switches or a pressure plate on the floor, but it didn't open. Strange, at least I already searched it. He shrugged and turned to move to the next room. Click, BRR. It opened when I wasn't looking. Jay turned his head away, yet it didn't close. Stepping away from the door, it remained open. Okay, so it's not a matter of being observed or not. Red, go through. Red walked through and back again, though there was no change in the door. So, it's responding only to me. Perhaps because I'm human and only when I turned around. Jay thought. Jay took off his bag and handed it to Red, who walked through the doorway. VRR click. Jay shook his head with a smile. It must have been that weird pendant I picked up. He nodded. Back on the surface before the assault on the castle even began, Jay cleared out a tower overlooking a plant flesh pit. Blue had taken a pendant off a skeleton in a white coat, the same pendant which now opened these doors. Come back, Red, waved the bag in front of the door. Click, VRR. Jay grabbed the bag and pulled out the odd pendant with a flat fabric rope. For good measure, he waved it in front of the door a few times, and each time the door opened and closed, confirming his theory. So they have automatic doors, then you need a special key to activate them. Interesting, Jay nodded, adding mental notes down for if he ever constructed his own fortress. The debut release of this chapter happened at NEO Grav v Euros LB1N. It impressed Jay with how the castle on the surface was merely the tip of the iceberg, a merely small representation of what it truly was. Using siege weapons, it would be a simple task to destroy and break down a normal castle, and once an army had cleared out the uppermost rooms of the castle, it would be considered conquered. However, an underground castle could not be destroyed by siege weapons, and there would be no telling how deep it would go. Sure, an army could clear it out, but will they have found every room and every secret passage? A false basement could be added, and an occupying force would never be sure if it had cleared the castle. There could be multiple escape routes through the earth, or a labyrinth of identical passages. Some enemies may simply get lost and die of starvation. Some passages could be used for a counterattack years later. With these things in mind, Jay had gained much more from this dungeon than simple armor pieces, and he could reproduce and copy even those. Red, here. Jay held out the pendant key, giving it to Red as he had the skeleton lead the way. 115, X. Blue and Sweeper slew Knight, serving as a reminder for Jay to hurry. However, he received another notification a second after. Your skeleton is no more. Oh good. Looks like Handy unsummoned itself. It will be nice having an extra skeleton around. He nodded, quickly summoning Handy back and giving it some bones to make itself a sword. Meanwhile, Jay and his other skeletons quickly went through the upper rooms of the hall, ignoring whatever was inside, and instead looking for any signs of cracks or breaches in the walls that the plant may have grown into, or passages leading to other areas. What the rooms all had in common was that they were different kinds of laboratories, some for chemicals, some for biology and others for materials. Many of the rooms contained oddities which surprised Jay, and he desired to investigate each and every one of them, but time was pressing, and so far there were no signs of the plant. Looks like we're going downstairs, Jay thought. 115, X. Another night slain. Reaching the bottom of the stairs, they went through a passage, lined with multiple large thick metal doors, all dented and broken. By the looks of it, something escaped using sheer force. Hopefully, whatever broke out of here has been dead for a while, Jay thought, but slowed his steps to reduce noise. The lights through the passage were no longer pure white like above, but a dark red color, barely bright enough to see properly. The passage soon opened up into a large circular room with a deep pit in the middle. A balcony went around the edges of the pit, which still had some glass windows overlooking the pit below. This must be like an observation deck, Jay wondered. Looking into the pit, Jay finally saw what he was looking for, or at least, what he thought he was looking for. What the fuck is that? This is what they were experimenting on. Multiple pulsing roots came through various cracks, tunnels and holes in the wall to combine, twist and merge with something that Jay didn't quite understand. It was hard to tell if it was flesh or plant, but in the center of the nest was a gigantic head, same shape as a human head, but giant, with shades of brown and green. However, the shape was where the similarities ended. Its skull was not solid, and it pumped up and down like a beating heart. Some roots carried nutrients away from it, but most carried them towards it. Its mouth was closed, but it fixed his eyes on one of the few sources of light in the pit. A shimmering portal, crackling with chaotic energies around the outside. A single root came through the portal, and it carried something different to all the other green fluid, as its surface had a light milky hue to it, being pumped into the giant plant flesh head. So there's a damn portal. Jay shook his head. He had not seen portals before, but it was similar enough to the dungeon entrances, which were their own kind of portal. Hopefully, if I kill that damn thing, this whole dungeon will end. Your skeleton has been slain. Shit, Blue and Sweeper are losing. He pursed his lips. I'd better get down there and kill this thing, before the knights come swarming through here. Looking into the pit, there was a passage at the back of it, along with a passage on the other side of the circular balcony. A fiendish smile appeared on Jay's face. Perhaps we can score some massive damage if we sneak attack it, he thought as he began to slowly creep around the balcony. All this time, the giant head had either not noticed him and his skeletons, or simply didn't care. His eyes remained fixed on the portal where the root containing a milky white fluid came from. Chapter 285 Cautious. Jay and the skeletons moved around the circular platform and went through the passage at the back of the observation deck. It led into another laboratory-type room. The room had various machinery along with various tools designed to extract plant samples, but Jay ignored it all, and continued down a set of stairs at the very back of the room. Your skeleton has been slain. The last skeleton fell at the T-intersection in the gate room. That's Blue and Sweeper both down. The knights will push through the wall of bones, escaping to warn their army. Not much time. Jay sent Lamp downstairs to scout while he created a pile of bones and summoned all of his skeletons, excluding Heavy and Dark, who are still outside of the dungeon. Yet Jay couldn't help but feel a little dissatisfied with Blue's performance and its decision to not keep Lamp. Blue didn't really do a good job up there. It could have lasted longer with Lamp, but only kept Sweeper with it. They barely killed any knights at all. Something must have happened, he thought. As the skeletons formed, Lamp came back up the stairs, which was surprising as it had not been scouting for even 1 minute. Jay raised a brow. Everything okay, Lamp? Lamp gazed at Jay through the eye holes in its human skin, and slowly shook its head. I guess not. What could make a skeleton retreat? Jay stepped away from the top of the stairs, paranoid as he was, and sent Lamp down again, except this time, he used the mana-hungry host skill, entering the eyes of Lamp and seeing through its eyes. Lamp came back safely, but there was no assurance that he would. There were only the faint dark red emergency lights, but it didn't bother Lamp with its shade vision. At the bottom of the stairs, a sheet of interweaving roots covered the floor. Lamp stepped 1 foot onto it, and suddenly something moved in the darkness. The roots opened up like a coffin, and from them, a humanoid figure appeared. It had no armor, but was not naked either. Instead, a covering of wriggling roots moved all over its body, many of them poking out and twisting through its flesh. The being didn't charge at Lamp, as there were roots connected to it from the back of its spine. So that's why Lamp stopped, probably why the knights don't bother coming here either. The plant has its own guards. Jay ended the host skill, conserving his mana. Looks like we'll have to fight that thing. It seems like it can't move, so I'll just wait at the bottom of the stairs, he thought, after seeing its body entangled into the ground. Jay sent the other skeletons down first before going down himself. If he was wrong, 5 skeletons would be there to lie down their lives for him. As Jay reached the bottom, it was much darker. They had destroyed many of the dark red lights, and only the dark silhouette of the enemy remained. In the shadows, it looked like a simple night as the roots covering its body moved in all the right places. The night army was likely closing in by now, but Jay took a moment to analyze his enemy, as it had caused Lamp to hesitate. Workless Oval Level 8. Type Construct, Plant, Vessel. HP, 208. Skills. Spire Knife Hand. 8 damage. Piercing. Spire Claws. 4 poison damage per second. Can stack 4 times. Long spines have pushed out and replaced the fingernails of this living construct, each of them coated in poison. Construct Scavenging. The construct steals the parts of its enemies to rebuild or reinforce itself. Elder Tree Conduit, passive. Sustained by a greater being. Immortal as long as it remains connected. 1% HP regeneration per second. Immobile.the debut release of this chapter happened at NEO Grav v Euros LB1N. Sleeper, passive. Does not work. Does not hunt. Only waits. Description. The ova is not alive, but it is not dead either. Its body is composed of colonies of living roots working together, which account for more biomass than the human flesh they inhabit, and it is more closely related to puppet types than a pure construct. They have discarded most of the human parts, or let them rot away, and it's a wonder why the living roots need the flesh at all. Perhaps they have not discovered how to make bodies on their own, and we can only hope they never do. Jay thought about how much damage he and his minions could do. The health regeneration will give it 2 health per second, but there are enough skeletons to ignore it. The poison won't do any harm to them, either. The problem is its scavenging ability. There's no telling how dangerous it is. Jay thought, watching it. The ova had no eyes, curling tendrils of roots poked out instead. The room was wide enough for Jay to pass by it, but there was no telling how many more of these enemies were hiding under the bed of roots. For now, it would be safer to take it out. Blue, you handle this one. Blue nodded, and the skeleton stepped off the stairs, onto the root-covered floor. Jay couldn't see the ground, but based on the height of the room above, guessed that the roots would be about up to his knees if he could touch it. The 4 skeletons walked towards the enemy and encircled it, 1 on each side. A simple but effective tactic they had used before. Strike when it turns its back. The ova lashed out, not liking this cheap strategy. Swiping its claw-like fingers, and spatters of poison landed on the skeletons. Its claws whistled through the air to little effect. Harmless unless they approached. It could do little against the skeletons, and without its back covered, a hacking sword landed on its back. Sweeper cleaved away a chunk of its flesh with chips of wood mixed in. Jay analyzed the enemy, tracking its health. The first hit did 10 damage. A small piece of the enemy's 208 health, and already it was regenerating. 5 seconds would be all it took to be whole again, yet Jay noted the damage of the skeleton's attack was exactly 10. Also, the skeletons can make level 2 swords. Jay thought, it's nice to see them learning in all areas. Jay himself could make 12 damage swords, as he could craft them as level 3, but right now, it's better to save his mana for summoning. 2 more skeletons landed blows, escaping unscathed by the spire claws of the ova. The health would be at 188 if the enemy didn't regenerate so quickly. Already it was back to 194. Yet simply attacking wouldn't be that simple, as Jay noticed the creature became more enraged when its health lowered, swinging its claws more furiously and chaotically. The random swings made the skeletons back off of their attacks, which allowed more of its health to regenerate. Damn it. We need to speed this up, otherwise this will take a while. Maybe this isn't enough to even defeat it. Be more aggressive. Jay ordered, and joined the battle himself. Jay stepped onto the roots and walked closer, just outside of the skeleton encirclement. The ethereal head of the necrotic helminth appeared on his shoulder, and a bolt crackling with necrotic energy shot out, landing on the knee of the ova. It staggered to one side, and the skeletons took complete advantage of it, as they brought their swords down over its back. The root which connected the ova's body to the elder tree took damage, but was not severed. Its health lost large chunks. In seconds, they brought it down to 124 health. Before it could be severed, the ova stood up and released a flurry of swipes, sending the skeletons back. Huh? Jay thought, checking its knee. The knee of the ova had turned to white bone liquid, but after a moment it solidified, giving the creature stronger shins. It simply reconstructed the knee with the living roots and returned to fighting. Ah, this thing is a real pain. Jay pursed his lips. Target the elder tree root connection. Chapter 286 Clone of Resurgence 1. More necrotic bolts landed on the aura's body, and they disabled it a few times, yet it was only temporary as the living roots replaced the damaged parts. Seeing that the necrotic bolts are not very effective, Jay called the attacks off, stopping the helmet from launching bolts. Its ethereal skull disappeared and nursed itself back on his shoulder. Better to save them for emergency, Jay thought. 4 skeletons surrounded the aura in on each side, cutting and slicing away at its flesh, whittling down its health. After sorting the skeletons into an attack formation, Blue waited at Jay's side, awaiting his orders. Blue, time to scout. Jay pointed through the long room to the giant, pulsing head in the next. Jay assumed there would be traps or more aura hiding among the roots, so Blue was really there to reveal them. Not that it knew. I could warn Blue, but I wanted to learn for itself. Jay thought, watching the skeleton march towards the middle of the room. The fight was going well, and so far, the skeletons had dodged any serious damage. The aura's needle-like claws simply didn't have enough range. The aura was down to 54 health, and gradually dropping as more hacking swords dug into his flesh. Slashes landed across the root, cutting more away, but the root connecting the aura to the elder tree had not been severed yet. The Ova prioritized the root connection for healing, and it could heal the damage before any more could be done. Having landed no attacks of its own, the Ova lashed out with its spine claws, yet it wasn't a normal attack, as each of them had a slender vine curled around them. Suddenly, the coiled vine sprung from the claws towards Handy. The unexpected attack left the skeleton defenseless. Handy slapped away some of them, but the others all landed on its body, quickly clinging to its bones. The vines coiled around Handy's leg, gripping it tightly and sinking into it. Snap. To Jay's shock, it snapped, twisted and ripped the leg off. The vines shot back to the Ova as quickly as they left it, pulling the bones apart and drawing them somewhere into its body. The Ova continued to fight, yet Jay was focused on the bones. He could still vaguely sense them. The roots traveled through his chest, down its torso and into its leg. It was clear what it was doing. "You little bastard," Jay smiled, shaking its head. The Ova used its construct scavenging ability. While Jay had melted the knee of the Ova using necrotic bolts, it was for nothing. The stolen skeleton bones moved into position and quickly replaced the missing parts, giving itself a new knee. Handy stood there, limping on one leg. The Ova attack had pulled closer and out of position. Finally, the Ova could return some damage. It slashed its claws, piercing and grazing Handy's ribcage. Handy raised its weapon but could not defend itself on one leg. Bones chipped and cracked away. Swinging its sword, it toppled backwards, getting away from the Ova's attacks. The skeletons were out of range again, but the Ova had learned a valuable lesson. It found a way to strike back. Turning to another skeleton, it released a second swarm of vines. Each of them hungrily grabbed onto the bones of Sweeper. Damn. I guess its intelligence is somewhere between the lesser and smart knights. Jay thought, still watching the fight, analyzing the enemy. Crackling sounds of dry snapping twigs sounded as they invaded the bones. Ripping away an arm, the Ova disabled another skeleton. Only 2 skeletons remained whole after the Ova forced the other 2 back. With fewer enemies harassing it, its health stopped dropping. Jay checked the health of the skeletons. Sweeper lost 11 HP, while Handy lost 8. It was not a lot, but Jay made a mental note to go nowhere near the creature. Seeing the limbs being twisted off, it looked far too painful. "Blue, replace Handy and Sweeper," Jay ordered, and had Handy and Sweeper came to him, at the sight of the fight. Jay held out some bones for the skeletons, summoning them in his hand for them to consume, but one broken jawbone appeared from the necrotic gas and slipped from his hand, falling to the ground. The jawbone landed on the roots below, and before a skeleton could reach it, the roots moved. A green tendril coiled around the bone. The roots parted and swallowed it. The jawbone disappeared. Immediately, Jay stepped back as his eyes widened in fear. "Fuck. What is stopping them from dragging me or the skeletons under?" he thought, but didn't let himself panic. The skeletons continued to eat and reform themselves. Jay made sure to not drop any more bones, but as he looked up to the fight, he noticed something else was wrong. Blue had not returned to help with the fight. Looking through the room, Blue was hacking away at roots and snaring its legs. Each of them reaching up and winding through the gaps in its bones, holding it in place. Immediately, Jay looked down at his own feet, glad to see they were free of entangling roots. "I need to get off these damn roots," he thought. Jay kept himself calm, not daring to take a step. The skeletons could move across the room, and forwards through the room, but not backwards towards the stairs. Other than Blue being deeper into the room, that's the only difference. "Handy. Move back towards the stairs," Jay ordered. The skeleton took a few steps backwards, but suddenly the roots under its legs came alive, reaching up and grasping at the skeleton, stopping it from reaching the stairs. Immediately Handy hacked away, trying to free itself. Meanwhile, the aura fought back against the 2 skeletons, harassing them back. Its health was stable, and no longer dropped, but it couldn't rise because of the 2 skeletons, so for now it was stuck at 46 HP. The skeletons attacked less, becoming more wary after seeing the aura's construct scavenging ability. Yet this was no longer Jay's concern. "So, the roots ensnare anything moving back to the stairs," he thought. "Then there's only one way forward." His eyes drifted across the giant pulsing head, and the roots trailing around it. But how many more of ore are waiting under the roots? How many are below my feet? That thing wants us to come towards it. What else could it be hiding? Handy, come back and kill the aura. Sweeper, join Red and Lamb to slay it. Don't let it grab you this time, Jay ordered. Handy cut away some roots and moved away from the stairs. Feeling the skeleton move into the room, the roots settled and stopped grasping at its legs. It gave Jay some relief, seeing that the roots would let them go as long as they moved away from the stairs. So it's a one-way trap. He slyly smiled. Well, I wasn't planning to go back. Anyway. The original appearance of this chapter can be found at NEOV Euros LS set 1N. Chapter 287 Clone of Resurgence 2. Red stepped forwards, snapping its sword into the Elder Connection root on the back of the aura. Red landed the hit, but its foot slipped on the root floor and slid forward. The aura shrugged off the hit, seizing the opportunity, and spun around with the only attack that had worked so far. Vines sprung from its spiral claws, hitting the chest armor Red donned. The vines crept into the gaps of the armor but couldn't pull anything away. Perhaps they were long enough. The original appearance of this chapter can be found at NEOV Euros LS set 1N. They quickly pulled back, not taking any prize with them, but this little detail didn't slip by Jay. So the armor can stop that scavenger attack. Good to know. He smiled. Red also noticed. Finding a tactical advantage, it responded by standing closer than the other skeletons. Jay nodded, glad to see its skeleton thinking for itself. Sweeper and Lamp returned to the fight and attacked while the aura focused on Red, attempting more attacks against its armor. Each time, the vines found a way into the armor, but it seemed they were not long enough to do any significant damage. It pulled Red towards itself, but the momentum channeled into a shield bash, and helped Red to scramble back. The skeletons attacked without restraint, and with 40 damage raining down each second, the aura became sliced up pieces at their feet. 831, X. The living roots which made up its body slithered away, escaping somewhere into the floor, and other roots poke out of the floor, claiming the remains of the human body parts that were the aura shell. Jay sighed, glad it was finally dead, or so he thought. Alright, move forward as a group. Go slowly, he ordered, not taking a step forward himself. The skeletons too moved over the roots, but something began moving behind them. From the floor, another aura rose. You gotta be kidding me, Jay looked at it hopelessly. The skeletons were out of range of the new aura, so at least it was no longer blocking the way. The new aura seemed to be smaller, and after analyzing it, Jay confirmed it was only level 5. It reconstructed itself from the remains of the body parts. I wish the skeleton could do that, Jay thought, a little jealous at seeing the creature rise again. Seems like it gets smaller as we destroy its body parts. I wonder if the opposite is true. If I give it more parts, will it become a god in this dungeon? He pondered, obviously not willing to try it out. The skeletons moved forward into the room, and the roots opened up ahead of them. 2 more aura sprang from below. Focus on one of them, Jay thought, not wanting to waste any more time. His stomach was feeling hunger pains. Both were level 8, but he would only need to kill one to slip past. The exp was good, but not worth it. The skeletons got to work with Red at the forefront, tanking the hits. The only attacks which landed were the vines, which had little effect against Red's armor. It wasn't long until they brought the aura down to half health. Jay had moved through the room and stood just behind the skeletons. He kept one eye watching the fight and another on the roots below, monitoring them for any changes, but between the clashes of swords on woody flesh, he heard something different. Something faint, but familiar. Distant clinking of rusted iron and steel. The knights are coming. He squinted back to the stairs and glanced towards the giant head through the next room. We're going too slowly, he thought, noting that all that was between him and the stairs was a measly level 5 OVA. The level 8 OVA ahead was down to 78 health. The skeletons had been fighting cautiously to conserve their health, but the time for caution was over. Go all out and end it fast, Jay ordered, while keeping his ears focused on the sounds of the coming knights. They grew louder each second. The skeletons each sprung forwards, hacking their swords, and now, slashing their bone claws too. Unfortunately, the OVA didn't bleed. Yet the damage was enough. The OVA didn't expect such a sudden change in aggression. It struck back fiercely, its spire claws jetting through the air. They slashed across 2 skeletons, sending spatters of its poison to coat the bones. 4 damage was all it could manage. The skeletons cared not for poison, their very being mocked the idea of it. Some of the poison landed on Jay's flesh. It was sticky and smelt sweet, but it was harmless unless it could enter his blood. Before it fell in battle, the ova released a last attack, and the spire claws pierced through Sweeper's ribsage. 831, X. Jay received a notification, but ignored it as the battle was still in progress. While it was the ova's last attack, it seemed to be quite a strategic one. Sweeper was standing between the two ova, and the force sent it reeling back into the other ova, who all this time could only watch the fight unfold. Finally, it had a chance. The skeleton wobbled backwards, towards it. Without hesitation, it used its construct scavenging ability on the skeleton's turn back. Sounds of dry snapping and twisting wood sounded as it caught the skeleton in its vine embrace. Snap. The vines curled around Sweeper's spine and, with a sudden twist, it ripped out the lower back of the skeleton. The lower torso and legs of Sweeper fell into pieces, and the hungry roots below claimed each of them as prizes. The ova continued the attacks against the remaining upper half of Sweeper. Sweeper defended itself, still holding its sword even while sprawled across the ground, though it would not last much longer. Lamp, pull Sweeper out. The rest of you, move up. Jay immediately ordered. Already, the ova they had just slain was reviving, coming back as another level 5 specimen. It forced Jay to dash ahead too, getting just past the range of the level 5 ova, otherwise it would separate him from the skeletons. Lamp raised his sword, blocking the spire claws, while it pulled Sweeper away from the other level 8 ova, and brought Sweeper's pathetic body to Jay. Jay and all the skeletons had made it past the 2 ova, and for a moment there was some respite. While sending the other skeletons forwards to find the next ova lying in ambush, Jay fed Sweeper bones. Sweeper was down to 1265 health. The spine rip did much more damage than any single attack. Splitting the skeleton in half was far more damaging than Jay predicted. Sweeper's max health was also 75, having gained 5 extra health from each part of its spectral armor, yet 2 of those were on its legs, which were now non-existent. For now, it would have to eat bones for them to reform. A slow process. Jay crouched at Sweeper's side and let Lamprey join the other skeletons. Feeding the skeleton bones was a relatively slow process, which was made slower as he didn't want to drop any more bones into the floor of roots, as the floor collected everything that was dropped on it. Jay didn't use his shell restoration as it used far too much mana, was still level 1, and it was necessary to conserve his precious mana. Meanwhile, the sounds of the coming nights grew louder, yet Jay couldn't help but wonder why these 2 ova didn't spring up when Blue crossed over them. There's something I'm missing here. But what? He pursed his lips, continuing to feed Sweeper as he thought for a moment, trying to ignore the imminent threat. Most of Sweeper's lower spine had reformed, but its legs and the spectral greaves would still need time. Stop. March no further. Jay ordered. Each of the skeletons froze. Before the skeletons could get too far ahead, Jay stopped them before more ova could spring up to face them. The skeletons, having minds, were confused, yet each of them trusted in their master and obeyed without question. I need to test something, Jay whispered. Chapter 288 Clone of Resurgence 3. Jay was at about the midpoint in the room. Slowly, and almost tenderly, he fed bones to Sweeper, whose lower body parts were growing back. Behind the small party of 7 including the helmet, were 3 ova, 2 of which were level 5. These 3 were the only barrier between them and the coming enemy. The knights were coming, sounds of their thick clanging armor and heavy marching growing louder. Time is running out, and Jay has to move. The original appearance of this chapter can be found at any OV Euros LS set 1N. Yet in this decisive moment, he stopped the skeletons, halting their advance. Red, give me your armor. He ordered. Despite the obvious tactical disadvantage of having no armor, Red didn't question its master, and unequipped the squire armor, giving it all to Jay. Good. He said, stashing it in his inventory. Blue. Go ahead by yourself. Lamp, follow at a distance, he ordered. Slowly, Blue moved through the room, yet it lowered its head, gazing at the floor below, ready for whatever may spring up. It walked across the roots, each step delicate and light, as it expected the roots to open up and spit out another ova to fight them. However, nothing happened. Blue reached the end of the room without incident. It turned back and gazed at Jay, wonder glowing through its ghostly green eyes. Another few moments, and Lamp was at its side, gazing back at Jay. So, it was a matter of weight. Basically, this entire floor is like a natural pressure plate. If I'm light enough, I should be able to walk through without incident. He nodded with a grin. It caused Jay to feel a little more relaxed, having figured out how to pass by the ova, without waking them up from their root coffins. Red, now you go. Jay ordered while still feeding Sweeper. Sweeper had reformed its body down to the knees, and would soon be whole again. However, the knights had finally reached the observation chamber, their clunking boots ringing through the chamber. Fuck. Jay thought and stared towards the back of the room. In seconds, 5 of the intelligent knights were rushing down the stairs, with many more to follow. The sounds of the knights grew louder, too. Many were following. The entire army was coming. However, for a moment, the intelligent knights hesitated on the stairs just before stepping foot onto the roots that was, until they spotted Jay and the skeletons. Jay could not see into their helmets, but he could feel their burning gazes piercing through him. He felt their vengeful wrath. And it was to be expected. The knight stared fiercely at Jay as its thoughts spiraled into bitter hate. Within the last 24 hours, this bothersome being had cut off their nutrient-gathering operations on the surface, severing the link to the flesh pits. We sent many knights into the forest to investigate, but found nothing but our dead kin, wasting our time. One village had gained full armor due to him leaving the corpses behind. This accursed being had destroyed the gate to our castle, blocking us from fixing the pits, and blocking any knights from returning to deal with these invaders, forcing more knights up from the depths. Somehow, this tiresome being has destroyed our patrol routes, and it cut many lesser knights off from their duties, making them useless. The intelligent knights had to fix everything, while it already stretched us thin. This spiteful being's minions killed so many of us, and just when we were about to storm and take back control of the gatehouse, they fucking ran. These creatures have no honor. Almost chaotically, this hateful being and its minions sprinted through the upper levels of the castle, pulling many knights out of position, and causing confusion in the ranks, and with broken patrol routes, the lesser knights became lost in our own home. Search parties are still being led by intelligent knights to find these skeletons in the upper castle, though, oddly, we had not seen them for a while. And the most evil and brutal act of this being was when it severed the roots from the elder nest to the world. Already, the birthing nest is dying. No new knights are being produced. Without the vital rejuvenation fluids, we will all soon perish. Without it, it will force us to eat our hosts until there is nothing left. This despicable being and its moving bone creatures have ruined everything. And somehow, it had made it past the Ova Guardians. In all the rage the knight felt, there was a mix of something else as it glanced at the human. Confusion. Wonder. Suspicion. Fear. Why is its face twisted like that? Why are its lips pointing upwards? I feel small before it did it form a pact with the elder. Yet it didn't matter now. The knight knew it would die soon, and only a remnant of the knights would survive to rebuild what will soon be lost. It stopped its true body from writhing in anger within the spine of the host it controlled. The best it could do now was to get revenge. Gripping its two-handed sword, the first intelligent knight no longer cared for consequences. The pact between the elder and its kin would have to be set aside. It resolutely stepped onto the root floor and charged ahead. The knights behind followed too. If one broke the pact, then they all did, and their anger burned just as much. They would not slay the elder, but would not let it stop them from slaying Jay, either. Suddenly, the floor writhed and wriggled as the roots responded to this provocation. The knights were not supposed to be here, and it responded accordingly. The heavy suits of the armored knights sent shockwaves through the roots, and before they could reach the first level 5 ova, many of the roots parted. 4 ovas sprung up, their needle claws already bunched together to form the armor-piercing knife-hand attack. The knights crashed against the ova, uncaring and full of spite. They would carve their way through hell if they needed to. A brutal clash between the knights and the ova began with spatters of spire claw poison and green blood. Jay caused an alliance to shatter, all the while smiling fiendishly and feeding Sweeper. Seeing them charge, it did not startle him in the slightest as he was counting on more of the ova appearing. Sweeper's legs and feet had reformed, but to complete the skeleton's spectral greaves, the shin armor, it needed more bones and more time. Jay glanced back, watching the first group of knights fight the 4 ova. The ova stopped their furious charge. I guess we have some time. Jay snickered, feeding Sweeper some more. As for the other skeletons, they all made it to the end of the room with no resistance. Seems like this won't take long at all. Jay smiled. His plan was simple. To kill the pulsing head. However, he couldn't help but wonder what any of this had to do with his quest to save the innocent. The last subject he would test with the needle of the starved would be the giant pulsing head, and he doubted this living megaplant would be innocent, not after seeing what it did with people. Whether it be turning humans into nutrients or using them as cloning pods to grow the army of the parasite knights, it was certainly not innocent by his own standards. Besides, he had already pricked one of its many roots before, and the needle of the starve turned red-tainted. It doesn't matter who or what is innocent now, anyway. I've come too far. I'm trapped here. The only way out now is through that portal, or through violence, desperate, savage, and fearful violence. He nodded, his face emotionless and resolute. But will the unknown be a better path? He glanced at the portal. The root coming out of it was still pumping milky fluids through, towards the giant head. Unflinching and uncaring, the giant head's gaze was still fixated on the portal. What is it staring at? Jay wondered. What could be so important? Chapter 289 Clone of Resurgence 4. Right in front of the stairs were 5 knights fighting 4 Ova. While the knights had the armor in their favor, blocking the construct's scavenging ability of the Ova, their damage was not enough to bring any of the Ova down. Besides, the Ova were twice their level, and while they could not attack with their vines, they still had an armor-piercing attack. Already, one knight was at half health. They could not resist the Spire Knife Hand. All 5 of them were intelligent knights, and could clearly see that they were making no progress. After a moment, they pulled back and focused on one Ova, the same strategy Jay had used. In a few moments, several more of the knights rushed down the stairs. Some hesitated before stepping onto the roots, but seeing their kin fighting, they marched ahead, joining the battle against the Ova. Time to move, Jay thought. He was happy that Sweeper was back to being complete. Jay went across the room first. He didn't want to send his last skeleton across, and then be left alone. First, he stashed everything heavy into his inventory, his homemade necrotic armor, bone sword, and shield. As for his backpack containing the black cube, he paused for a moment, and then made the tough decision to toss it across the room. Hopefully, I won't break it. He shrugged. Clink. Star. The bag landed about halfway between him and the end of the room. His weight was not enough to trigger any sleeping Ova. Good enough, Jay thought. Slowly, he walked across the room. Jay wasn't exactly sure how much weight it would need to trigger an Ova to spring up, and he made sure each of his steps was on one of the larger, thicker roots, hoping they would support more of his weight. Glancing back at the fight, Jay gauged how much time he had. The 12 knights had already slain one of the level 8 Ova, and split into 2 groups to fight 2 more yet, before they could start on the next enemy. It was already reconstructing into a lesser level 5 Ova. Jay mockingly grinned and turned back, walking towards his bag. Approaching it slowly, he reached out and slowly lifted it up. His feet felt so heavy on the roots, like he was about to snap them. If we were to be stopped here, the Ova would separate him from his skeletons. There was no telling how many Ova would rise from below, and the knights would catch up. As he lifted the bag, suddenly, the roots moved. Fuck. Too heavy. Grasping the back, Jay didn't jump back. Instead, he pushed his head down and hugged it to his chest. Iskian. Whoosh. A jet of air burst from his boots, sending him flying across the room and into a mad sprint. An aura slowly rose from the ground, but Jay had already dashed over it. More roots moved, but they were simply too slow. I gotta remember to thank Sullivan for these boots. Jay shook his head with a smile. As Jay ran across the roots, many more Ova sprung up, and a few times he nearly sprained his ankle on the shifting floor, but somehow he made it to the skeletons at the end of the room. The end of the room had a small entrance leading into the chamber with the giant head, so the roots coming from it packed thickly in the entrance. Perhaps it supports more weight, or maybe there are no Ova here. Jay guessed, wondering why he and his skeletons could all stand here without incident. Looking back, Sweeper stood there, glancing at the many Ova between Jay and itself. In the wake of Jay, many Ova had risen, 5 of which were around the area that Jay released a burst of air from his enchanted boots. Jay smiled. Poor Sweeper. Somehow, Sweeper looked as helpless as it was hopeless while it stared at Jay through the room. Nevertheless, it gripped its sword and made a valiant dash along the side of the room, making it past an Ova in the middle. An Ova released some vines, but they only tapped against Sweeper's bones, not getting any hold. Ahead of Sweeper, another Ova waited, yet it did not discourage Sweeper in the slightest. Pivoting to the side, it ran into the center, aiming for a gap between 2 Ova. The 2 Ova found their chance, and each of them released their vines towards the skeleton as it came near. Sweeper decisively threw its sword forwards, sending it to land at the feet of Jay and the skeletons. Good. It saved its weapon. Jay nodded approvingly. Seeing the vines coming towards it, Sweeper frantically waved its arms. Jay raised a brow, watching the desperate skeleton, wondering what it was about to do. It was disappointing, as he had just healed it, but it was entertaining at the very least. The waving arms of the skeleton slapped away some vines, but many of them clung to them, grasping onto the bones and coiling. They were like tormenting shackles as they wrapped through its bony arms. No vines had touched Sweeper's torso, and without slowing down, its arms suddenly detached and popped off. The solidified necrotic mana holding them dispersed into puffs of green gas. Huh. Jay smiled, impressed. The ova had claimed its arms, and now the armless skeleton was running across the roots, seemingly without a care in the world. The original appearance of this chapter can be found at any OV Euros LS at 1N. More ova were up ahead, forming a line. There was no way Sweeper could get past. Now what, Jay wondered, seeing that the skeleton had not given up. Sweeper charged recklessly right towards them. Right towards its death. The ova all held their arms at their sides, as if they were about to embrace it in a hug, vines coiled around each of their spire claws, ready to spring. Sweeper won't make it, Jay thought, shaking his head. Suddenly, the armless skeleton jumped. It sprung high into the air above the heads of the ova. Its body was much lighter, with no arms. Yet the roof was not that high. Its back and head skittled across the stone roof and sent it back down, falling just behind the wall of ova. The ova were just as shocked as Jay was. He was simply speechless. One ova suddenly turned around, releasing the vines from its claws. Sweeper had trouble getting up. Without arms, it was too difficult. It was not fast enough. The vines were coming right towards its lower back, threatening to split its spine in half a second time. Boom. Suddenly a crackling ball of deathly energy burst against the ova's arm. The bones melted out and its arm dangled helplessly at its side. The vines recoiled. None landed on the skeleton. Master saved Sweeper. Sweeper pushed its skull against the ground and limped back to his feet, returning to a sprint across the roots. It hastily dashed past another single ova, and finally, it made it back to its master. Ah, very nice. Quite entertaining. Well done, Sweeper. Jay smiled, holding out more bones for it to consume. Jay glanced back through the room, assessing the number of ova guardians he had awoken. About 15 of them, but I'm guessing there will be more hiding under the surface that will awaken when the nights come through. He thought, plenty of time to investigate the next room. Turning to glance into the next room, he could see more details of the giant head. Numerous green veins and white arteries were covering over its pumping head like a fishing net. Despite being the shape of a giant head, it had muscles traveling through it, each of them lean and defined. Even though it has eyes, it almost seems like a heart rather than a head. Perhaps it's a mix of both, Jay thought. Chapter 290 Clone of Resurgence 5. The skeletons moved first, followed by Jay and Red, entering the enormous circular chamber, which seemed much larger from down here than from the observation deck high above. It could hardly be called a room, and was more like a cavern. It seemed like they had carved a whole hill out of here. Jay guessed that perhaps the entire Adventure Association would fit inside, along with the palisade wall surrounding it. If he were to throw a stone with all his might, it would not reach halfway across the room. The enormous head still ignored them, continuing to pump the green fluid through the root system, and each time its forehead pulsed, Jay felt a gentle breeze waving backwards and forwards. I wonder if severing the roots of the castle affected it. Jay scratched his chin. The room itself smelled fresh, as if he were in a forest, and apart from the noise of the fighting knights and ova behind them, there was only a subtle, deep beating sound that came from the head, sounding more like a ticking clock than a heartbeat. Jay still had to feed some bones to Sweeper to grow back its arms, so he took a moment to analyze and think things through. Above them on the observation deck, a flurry of knights rushed over. The unending masses of knights were coming, not only to secure their castle, but now, for revenge. Jay glanced back into the room he had just come through, seeing more ova awaken and arise from their root coffins below, as they responded to the oncoming wave of knights. As for how long they will last against the raging knights, Jay could only guess. Alright, let's get this over with, he thought, turning back to the giant head. The head was still staring into a portal at the back right side of the room, ignoring his presence. The portal had a silver mirror surface which seemed to ripple like water as a root pumped the milky substance through it. There was no telling what was on the other side, or what was sending the milky white fluid through. Jay sent Lamp and Handy around the edge of the circular room towards the portal, firstly to see if any more ova were in here. Lamp and Handy were cautious at first, plodding along slowly, but seeing it was calm, they sped up to a brisk walk, and eventually they were running, traveling around the edge of the room where the roots met the wall. So no ova here. Jay raised a brow. With Sweeper back to full form, he sent it in Blue towards the giant head in the middle of the room. Red stayed at Jay's side as his personal guard. Jay kept Red's armor in his inventory in case it died, not wanting to lose it in this dungeon. The blueprints were more important to him than a temporary advantage. Besides, if there was an emergency, he could simply have Red don its armor again, and by conserving his mana, it was almost back to being full again, ready to summon multiple undead. Jay made a quick glance back as the battle behind him grew louder. The swarm of knights charged into the Ova without mercy. As their numbers swelled, there were no longer any tactics. It was just a brutal, armored swarm of wrath. A wave of metal crashing against whatever would dare to stand in their path. Yet the Ova held strong and defiantly remained in place. They were immobile, attached to the root on the floor they stood on, a part of it. Unyielding to the knights, they stood firm. Jay curiously watched while he waited for his skeletons to get into place or uncover enemies. Every so often, a knight fell and its body disappeared into the roots below. A moment later and another Ova would rise, although none of the new Ova would be above level 8 either. This insignificant detail caused Jay to smile mischievously. I see how it works now. He nodded. Jay went back into the passage with the Ova. Just before he would get into range of an Ova lashing at him, he held his necrotic gauntlet up. A luminous dark green glowed from it. I hope you're hungry. He smiled, and a sickly green cloud of mana appeared. From the mana, bones appeared, vomiting out onto the floor like a river. Jay instantly deposited 30 complete Helvetian human skeletons. The root floor responded, ravenously swallowing them, tearing them apart. In moments, the mass of bones disappeared. Yet they were not gone for long. The roots opened up, and suddenly, an entire assembly of Ova rose. There were less than 30, as they needed other parts of a human body to create an Ova, but this blockade was enough to stop the charging masses of knights, no matter how many would come into the room. Alright, that's taken care of for now. Jay nodded, happy with his work. Walking back into the circular chamber, he saw Lamp and Handy had made it halfway around the outside, while Blue and Sweeper were about halfway to the center of the room, halfway to the flesh plant head. Let's get moving, Red. Jay thought, moving around the outside of the room too. Compared to Lamp and Handy, who were running, Jay moved at a more cautious walking pace. Jay glanced at the giant head as he went. Still, there was no reaction, its eyes fixated on the portal. I wonder what level it is. It's confident enough to ignore me even while I'm here, or perhaps it can do nothing. I'm sure it's powerful, though, as it has been feeding on the whole dungeon for years. He nodded. The sounds of charging knights continued above. They were like a threatening thunder, yet it only caused Jay to smile as he thought about the blockade of Ova he just set up after gifting them some bones. Well, it was a cheap trick, it was something only Jay could do. There were no other adventurers who carried around thousands of corpses. At least, none that Jay knew of. Suddenly, there was a movement near the head. Before Blue and Sweeper, the roots moved. So many shifted around that they lost their balance. Curling around each other and twisting together, they formed what looked like a slender tree trunk that continued to rise. However, it was not all made from the plant flesh material. At the very top, a giant talon-shaped stone appeared. White and sharp, it was the size of Jay's body. Sitting atop the root tower, it grew to be the height of a 4-story building. Blue, fall back, Jay immediately ordered, seeing the large tentacle-like tendril already falling towards them. Blue and Sweeper both got back to their feet, dashed back. The root picked up speed. It not only fell, but actively flexed towards them, causing the wind to howl around it. Sweeper and Blue bolted right below it, but were not fast enough. Both were about to be crushed into powder. Boom. The giant root tentacle smashed into the ground. Jay felt the shock through his feet as the deep sound echoed through the castle. Green blood spurted everywhere as it smashed heavily into the floor. The original appearance of this chapter can be found at any OV Euros LS at 1N. Yet it took no enemies with it. While commanding, Blue had come to value his combat awareness. Even as it ran, it continued to glance back at the impending doom. Right before it smashed them to pieces, Blue pushed Sweeper on the shoulder, sending them both to each side of the fearsome tentacle. The immediate shockwave sent them both staggering, falling onto their knees. The giant tentacle was not done, though. It slid backwards as it raised itself up again. Blue and Sweeper sprinted away and were nearly out of range. The root flexed, whipping its enormous trunk towards them. Blue moved to Sweeper's side, ready to push Sweeper and dodge the tentacle again. The root howled through the air, and as Blue looked back, it saw that they were almost out of range. Only a little further and they would be safe. I may not even need to dodge. Blue was sure they would be safe before it fell. However, the route curved differently than before. Blue, dodge now. A heavenly voice rattled through Blue's mind. Blue obeyed instantly. His body moved on its own. Yay, boom. A flash of a white stone blinked past Blue's eyes, confusing the skeleton. It was sure they had made it far enough. The destruction left on the root floor from the previous attack didn't even reach this far. Yet the white stone was there, embedded deeply into the ground. How was the stone right next to it? Sweeper was in pieces again. His body split into two. Bones shot off in random directions while it snapped and crushed others. Bring Sweeper back, Jay ordered, watching from the edge of the room. The root was moving back again, yet the white claw-shaped stone stayed pierced into the ground. The root tendril didn't do a crushing attack. Instead, it had whipped its body and hurled the giant stone like a projectile. Neither Blue nor Sweeper were prepared for such an attack, only Jay realized. Damn it, Jay thought, so we can't get close to the head. That just leaves one option. His eyes glanced towards the silvery portal, crackling with chaotic blue magic around the outside.